Turpentine on Reddit asks, API and front end, split a story or no? They asked, I'm under the impression that a story should be fully deliverable item. Front end and back end are broken up into tasks under that story. We currently have some teams breaking those into a UI story and a separate back end functionality story, often worked on in different sprints. This seems to be a clear opportunity to be reworked as one story and be more efficient. But I get pushback on API development versus front end development. In my mind, this is still front end versus back end, but I have team members saying, but an API is fully deliverable and testable, which I imagine is true, but it isn't really delivering the full piece of value that we wanted towards a feature. I argued that at best, it's a technical enabler story, if not part of the full deliverable. And so the entire question is basically, how do you manage the delivery of value when it is something like a UI that needs both the back end to change and the front end to change before, the user of the software can't see that the API is delivering the information if the UI isn't. So sure, from the product perspective, you haven't delivered the value. And I don't know, I think we might have talked about this similarly in a past episode, but I do think it's a weird balancing act between, if the back-end and front-end teams are agreeing on what these data contracts are, then it can happen in parallel. There's no reason that there might be team capacity reasons why it doesn't happen at the same time, but you as the product person working with them to define all of that kind of stuff should be happy that if the API is delivering what the UI is expecting for it to deliver, then that is progress and that is incremental towards the value. I don't know why a product person should start to care whether that's a subtask under one user story or a separate user story. This is where I think maybe we were talking about data product owners and what the role of a product owner is and how technical some of these product folks need to get. You got to get creative. You got to be able to say, great, during the sprint demo, I'm not going to have a UI screen that shows me that it's now doing a thing, but you can pull up Postman and run the API call, and I can see that the API call returns the 7 data points you said it would return for the UI to expect later. Like, you got to get a little technical. You got to start to understand, what does a JSON object look like when it gets returned by an API, so you can validate, yep, that's what we agreed to with the UI team, and I can sign off on this user story being acceptance criteria done. Yeah, I kind of... Welcome to the modern web. I think that's not an unreasonable expectation of product owners. I get why conceptually you haven't fully delivered the value, but that's how teams tend to work these days. I don't know. I'd be curious if you come down on a different way on this.
No, I think I always feel bad when I say this, but I think sometimes it's a bit cultural too, like what the teams used to, right? Like, but I'm with
Sure.
you on this one. Like, I don't think it's super. I don't think it makes or breaks, right? Anything. But my notes on this one were absolutely the API being in its own story, because I can see where the API has extra trimmings, different types of test cases that the UI has, where
Right.
yeah, as the API team building, and again, I think it's different if it's an existing API versus a new API and it's your first
Right.
time getting into APIs. But yeah, I'm looking at that and saying, yeah, in Postman, I I'm looking at my must, I'm looking at my entity that it's returning, and then I'm also, because it's an API, I'm thinking to myself like, uh, it could get called by custom engineers. So maybe it's like an API that's going to be used by the UI, but it's also, there's a bunch of guys in data science who are like, hey, I can use that as well. So I could see how these could be different. I will say though that I've really enjoyed working at companies, and I don't think it's that I enjoyed the subtasks and tasks in stories. I think it's
Sure.
because, again, the team that I was working with had reached a level of maturity on that process that they did it well. Like, it was very
Right.
deliberate for them to do that. So they could write stories and then break them out into separate technical sort of tasks. But yeah, this is not one of those things I would think about unless it was new versus existing, and then some of the testing scenarios and usage scenarios.
Yeah, I've definitely been on teams where they did subtasks and it didn't, like, I guess this is the thing that I'm getting stuck up on. One of your comments about like getting back to agile purists. Why are you hung up on the mechanism? If your team works effectively in 2 different user stories that have to be managed in 2 different sprints, that's on its face. There's no difference. What, like, you're gonna have 4 objects in Jira: the epic, the user story, the API task, and the API task, or you're going to have 4 objects in Jira. The epic, the API, or guys, 3 objects in Jira, the API story and the user interface story. I don't know. Like, to me, you seem to be getting hung up on the wrong thing. You're going to have to evaluate value one way or another. I'm not sure why it matters. That it's a capacity and engineering team problem. Whether or not they were both on the same team working in the same sprint on subtasks or working on 2 different teams, I don't know. Like, yeah, stop worrying about this. Make sure that you're measuring the value.
If this is what I was worrying about every day, I don't even
No
know.
wonder I would hate my meetings. No wonder I wouldn't want to be a.
Yeah, I would be. I guess I'd skip out of work and like go into the kitchen and like, hey, honey, give the kids a kiss and just be right as rain all the time. Like, yeah,
no,
I wish what this
you're
was
focused
all.
on the wrong thing.
Yeah, it's just a weird place to get hung up.
Yep.